right. Good morning, everybody. Who do you look up to spiritually and why? What are the metrics that you use? Have you even thought about it? Because sometimes people don't have criteria until you have to think about it. And by the time that you think about it, by the time that you need it, you've not yet had these thoughts. So a lot of times we create a certain level of standard for ourselves based on not having standards on a time that we needed it and didn't have it. Have you ever had that experience? Where you're like, I didn't think I had to think about this. But now that I have to think about it, let's do it, right? And so there are times when we can't find the bottom of our feet, right? Like if you're like in the ocean or when you're at the pool somewhere, etc. When you're a little kid, right? If you were to put your feet on the ground, you would lose breath because it's so deep, right? And so we have to figure out first, do we have to put our feet on the ground? Sometimes that's not biologically possible. That's not practical. That's not the solution. And if we can't, how do we stay afloat? And sometimes this is the conversation that you have with yourself in a spiritual crisis. I believe that the world right now is in a spiritual crisis, collectively. And you may not see it, you may not notice it because it's not close to you. It's not based on proximity. It's based on awareness and perception. And it reminds me that the character in Chinese for crisis I have it somewhere in my Google Drive as a JPEG. But the crisis character in Chinese has two pieces, has two I guess the word at crisis has two characters in Chinese. And one of them is change and the other is opportunity. And so when you think about what a crisis is you've been thrust into a new, unseen kind of situation or circumstance. But it's not all bad. And part of the trick that our mind does is thinking that if something is new, then that means there's danger. And that's one of the reasons why we conflate our comfort zone with what's familiar. Sometimes the stuff that's in your quote unquote comfort zone is not comfortable at all. Some people are really comfortable being broke, for example, but being broke is not comfortable. Some people are really comfortable being in a emotionally distant marriage or relationship or whatever, but that's not comfortable in the true sense of the word. And so I want to take those pieces apart for the purposes of this conversation. Because if you go back to what is quote unquote familiar, that may not necessarily be number one, what's naturally comfortable for you, and number two, what would actually compel you for growth. So here are some of the ways in which we look up to someone or look up to something and look at it as a resource for our own spiritual crises or own spiritual times of change. You may be reading biographies or memoirs, or now in the days of content creation, you may look at somebody's social media platform or their videos or their YouTube channel, et cetera, because there's content there that feels good to your soul, that feels like a sermon on Sunday morning, that feels like a conversation with a really good friend. And then there are some times when you need to sit in front of someone, right? There is a tradition in the Hindu tradition where instead of quote unquote going to church, you're attending darshan. Darshan is just a time of wisdom. And the quote unquote guru or teacher who sits at the front, you come to that guru and you sit at their feet, right? And that's where we get the phrase sitting at the feet of the guru. And as a gesture of devotion, as a gesture of acknowledgement of their wisdom, people would sometimes wash or kiss their feet. And the topic today is asking you about who do you do that with, symbolically or literally. When you find yourself at a loss for words, for wisdom, etc., who do you look up to? Who do you go to? And what in you do they point to in order for you to be able to gain your footing again, to gain your center again? That's the part that I think I find, at least, most valuable in my relationship with my mentors, is this conversation of the people that I consider most masterful are not looking for followers. They're always looking at you, pointing you back to yourself. Masters create masters, leaders create leaders. If you're a quote unquote master creating followers, then you are looking for a party where you're the entertainment, right? um, and then the question, of course, that follows is, what's the criteria that you use? Ronald says, I never thought about it. When and um, how do I know, like, I'm in a spiritual crisis, for example? Well, you will know. Just like you'll know when you're drowning, right? Um, what does that feel like? What is the experience of being in a spiritual crisis? Sometimes it's this feeling of malaise. Like, I don't know what's wrong. There's just something wrong. It could be something as little, like, low level headache as that, right? There's just general sense of dissatisfaction. There could also be this general anxiety feeling of, like, doom, or waiting for the other shoe to drop, or knowing that there's something quote unquote bad that's going to happen out there in the future, and you're just kind of bracing for impact. Sometimes we call that anticipatory grief in psychology. And it's a little bit like what happens when you know somebody's dying, they haven't died yet, but they're not altogether there. So when my dad passed and my brother passed, those were long swaths of time. There was a long time between this is no longer my father, this is my patient, and when he actually passed. And in that time, there was this anticipatory grief of, like, when is it going to happen? Is this the final conversation, et cetera, et cetera. So that level of generalized anxiety is part of it. And then the other part of it is sometimes, you gesture broadly to the world, you look at stuff that's happening, whether you look at the news or you are involved in local politics or whatever, and you just have this, like, I have no answers. WTF is this? I mean, this is unprecedented. This is uncanny. Are we humans? What are we doing? And this sense of despair or of cynicism or of, I have no words, right? Like this general sense of, I have no words. What is this? And that can be met with disdain or dread, resignation, right? For some, even cynicism. And the cynicism is basically like, this wouldn't be happening if there was really a God. That kind of cynicism is what I'm talking about. And so when you find yourself in that level of spiritual crisis, who centers you? Who gives you perspective? Who brings you back to your own ground so that you can find yourself? And for some people, we don't have that. We don't have that person in our world, in our life, in our family, in our circle of friends, in our circle of mentors, etc. So we look to that person in books, in memoirs, in biographies, and, a spiritual leader somewhere out there. We have a different relationship with organized spiritual traditions now than we did maybe even 20, 30 years ago. And I believe the reason for that isn't because there's an increase in cynicism in the general population, but rather because all of those spiritual gurus or leaders, even in their imperfection, their downfall, their mistakes, their criminal activity, etc., are doing what spiritual leaders do. which is point you back to yourself. That's the natural order of things in that regard. And so, what do you do? Here are some questions that I find useful for myself, and maybe you'll find them useful as you take them on. It's easier sometimes to have these kinds of conversations with yourself or ask these questions of yourself in a personal situation, but they apply collectively as well. Question number one. What is this here to teach me? What is this here to teach me? If it's here to teach me anything, what is this here to teach me or remind me of? Right? If this is a call to action, what am I being called to? If this is a call to action, what am I being called to? Some stuff is happening because it's calling you to deeper political activism. Maybe it's calling you to run for office. Maybe it's calling you to grow your own food because you see the world going to hell in a handbasket and you're like, let me just at least feed my children. It may ask you to consider being a global citizen and not stay put in one country. So it's not like, what is this here to teach me, like this broad out there concept. Sometimes what is here to teach you is very practical, very logistical. Pack your bags and go, right? And if your inner wisdom is anything like mine, it speaks in short, staccato, instructive, matter of fact, charge neutral sentences, right? And sometimes these things are here to make you look somewhere where you've been unwilling to look. So the third question that you might find useful is, what have I been unwilling to see or do until now? What have I been unwilling to see or do until now? And sometimes if you want a little razzle dazzle in that question, ask it of myself. What have I been willing to do for myself or see about myself until now? And this is a lot of shadow integration work, children. A lot of shadow integration comes from these questions. Because we're so conditioned, the ego is so conditioned to preserve rightness. It hates to be the bad guy, even in somebody else's story. That's why we do a lot of defending and justifying. It hates to be the bad guy. It hates to be the villain. And it hates to be wrong, which is tantamount to being the villain in your own story for yourself. And so a lot of shadow integration is doing away with that and being willing to sit with, how are you the quote unquote bad guy? How are you the quote unquote villain in a particular story? Sometimes with yourself, that's your self-sabotage, right? Your smallness. And sometimes with another person is you've hurt them, you've disappointed them, you've betrayed them, you've lost their trust, you've done something, right? And when you begin to face that, then when something external comes, like a quote unquote external crisis, you have more gravitas, you have more humility, you have more stamina and persistence and resilience because you've been able to sit in the fire of your own making. And so the fire of somebody else's making doesn't singe you the way that it would if you were unprepared with your own lack of self-awareness. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about who you look up to and why. I'll go first. There used to be a time, now they're memories because these people have made their transitions, but there used to be a time when I used to really look up to, you've heard me say this, Reverend Dr. Mary Tompkin. I used to go to her church. And she was very matter of fact about spiritual universal law principle. If X, then Y, very, very mathematical like that. And so for me, that level of clarity and that ability to just kind of bottom line stuff, I looked up to that because in the face of confusion, you're considering multiple things and multiple points of view and da-da-da. And I really admired the fact that she was able to just singe it to its essence and make a decision or choose a position based on very clear universal principles. So that's my answer to that question. What about you? Who do you look up to spiritually and why? Good people.
Grand Rising.
Hello.
Grand Rising, my sister. Grand Rising, everyone.
Hi, hi.
I love the whole spectrum of what you is feeding us with. For
Mm-hmm.
me, it's feeding, and it's for me, it's like helping me to really understand myself. But I look up to one of my ancestors, a grand aunt of mine that raised my mom, and I look up to my mom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a it's an admiration that I have vividly into me. And up to 2 days ago, I was speaking to my sister and I say, anytime I come back, I want the same mom. Even she used to burst my behind, I want the same mom. Because what I am today, I am so grateful that she instilled everything that I am. I am full of gratitude. I am full of have have knowing how to live life and know how to really share my my gift with the universe. And this
Mm-hmm.
is what this woman is all about. And that's what she instilled in us. I remember the neighbors, them kids used to come over and they used to gravitate to this black woman. We used to just call her, we neighbor call her Blackie. And it was amazing to see how much love she could give 7 of our kids and like 15 of the neighborhood kid. And she used to cook, and everybody could come there and get a plate of food. But it wasn't the plate of food, it was the love that they was looking for. So
Mm-hmm.
I admire that black woman. And she's 88 years old now. And
Beautiful.
she's still there. And I'm
Beautiful.
telling you, she's going for a long time. She's going for a long time because our mom lived when she was 90 days before she turned 100.
Wow.
So we are longevity family. So definitely my
Yes,
mom, my mom.
yes.
Thank you so
Your
much.
family is its own blue zone.
I know. And my grandmother, my grandmother from father's side, 105. So I
Mm.
am not going nowhere no time soon. Trust me.
All right. All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Beautiful. Who else? Who do you look up to spiritually and why? What do they provide for you? Who do you go to kind of like as a backup or for answers or to strengthen your faith or to give you answers or that kind of thing?
May I jump in?
Yes, who's that?
Yes, this is Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Yes, Grand Rising. Thank you for this powerful conversation.
Yeah.
And yes, um, I used to look up on God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As a child, I was conditioned to look to God for my salvation. My-
Mm-hmm.
and I came to a point where I was grieving at a young age and started to rebel against that concept and starting to search until I've discovered or I'm uncovering that the God I was looking up to was the God within me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in the process of studying, learning, and understanding more about how to lean into that God, that light within me. And I appreciate what Rashida shared about her mom because my mom was similar. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't live with her, but my mom, wow, she was uneducated, but she was deeply spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And what I experienced from her is her faith in whether it was outside of her or not, but what she would accomplish by her prayer, by her fasting, how she could wake up in the morning and send us for herbs and observe how she was in tune with nature and especially the herbs to help to facilitate healing in others. You know, so much I've learned from her and her stories that even though I didn't live with her, but I now, even though she's deceased, is reflecting on her power as a spiritual being. With that,
Mm-hmm.
I'm complete. It's noisy out there. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for that. Good stuff. Let me push the envelope a little bit and ask you this. Do you ever seek solace or spiritual comfort from someone who has passed on? Has that ever, is that ever in your pantheon of spiritual wisdom? A lot of traditions do ancestral veneration, and not from the point of view of worship necessarily, but from the point of view again of a comfort, guidance, wisdom, etc. Some of our ancestors were indeed sources of spiritual strength and comfort when they were here. Or if you missed it generationally, right, because they lived 100 years ago, perhaps the family story and the family lore has painted them in that way. And so you want to think about that? Is that part of your spiritual comfort pantheon?
Can I
Or do you have it like, ooh, that's isn't that blasphemous?
can I jump in?
Yes.
Uh Thank you so much for really digging deep.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I practice, and everyone who visits I always says my sanctuary or my mansion, everyone have this concern that, especially my grandkids, I feed the ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
They bought it to feed the ancestors, and everybody say, "What is the reason of feeding the ancestors?" I say, and trust me, sometimes I don't eat flesh,
Mm-hmm.
and I will feed the ancestors flesh because they asked me to feed them the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Don't ask me. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a spiritual calling. I've been feeding the ancestors for the past 17 years,
Mm.
and it's amazing because when I ring the bell, when I put they serving and I ring the bell, you literally, I can tell people, you literally smell the food because they come and partake of that food. So
Wow.
I am so in tune with
Mm-hmm.
feeding the ancestors, and I feed them once a day, and I feed them with a lot of devotion, and I am connected to them. I am, I will say, and someone or some of my ancestors back, because in the instill in what I got into my upbringing,
Mm-hmm.
what I got from able to feedback on them. So yes, and sometimes, don't get me wrong, people come to my house and say, "Are you crazy? You feed the ancestors?" I say, come and let me teach you how to feed the ancestors. And I have many people leave my house and start to feed the ancestors. As crazy as it look, they go back and they say, "Oh, where you get the little dishes and the little fork and knife?" And I'm telling you, a whole setting have
Mm-hmm.
ancestors. And this is something that I learned from a Japanese girlfriend of mine, that we've been girlfriend friend for 20 years, and she's feed the ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just in tune with that, and still is in tune with that. So my granddaughter, she went and get some little pots. She baked them at school 3 years ago. And I said, "Why are you making those little potters?" He says, "Nana, I want to feed the ancestors like how you do." And she,
Beautiful.
right now, she's 11 years old. At the time, she was 8 years old when she started feeding the ancestors. So, mind you, it's a connection. And for me, it's spiritual. And I love doing it.
I love that. I love that. One of the conversations that I delight being in, thank you for bringing all of that in your contribution, Rashida, is that comparison. I mean, the degree was in comparative religions, right? That I went to grad school for. Because you can see the difference in the longevity of some of the spiritual traditions that humans have had throughout history by one, how they treat each other. And I don't mean each other like if you're already on my team. I mean, how do you treat the least of these, as the Bible says? And two, their relationship to lineage. So for a group of people whose spiritual text begins with in the beginning was God, or in the Old Testament when it begins with lineage of, you know, how to prove that Jesus came from the line of David and so forth, all the way to Adam. For someone whose spiritual tradition focuses on lineage this way, it's interesting to me that they don't have lineage in their practices, and part of that is because of colonization. But that's another sermon for another Sunday. Thank you so much, everybody, for having this conversation with me. Cece says she's learning about family and ancestors through family trees on ancestry.com and newspapers and so forth. This may be a topic. What do you think? We may have to insert this into our Thursdays conversations, in terms of the role that ancestors play in our spiritual health. That may be something. Again, thank you so much for being here. Remember to love generously, laugh a lot, sleep at least 7 to 8 hours, and set your alarm. Eat more plant-based, stress less, move your body. Remember that twerking is a Kundalini raising spiritual activity. I don't care what they tell you. And of course, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Always audit your assumptions. We love you. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you. Excellent job.
Thank you, Doc. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.